Back when I was 20, the summer before my senior year of college, I landed an internship at a small financial firm downtown. It wasn't glamorous, mostly spreadsheets, data entry, and sitting in front of a computer for hours, but it paid well enough and looked good on a resume. There were 7 other interns in our cramped open office section, all squeezed into rows of cubicles that gave just enough privacy to avoid small talk, but not much more. 5 of them were easy to get along with, a mix of laid-back students who didn't take the internship too seriously. Another guy, Mark, was the opposite, serious, quiet, constantly typing like his life depended on it. Then there was the last intern, Ryan. At first glance, Ryan seemed normal, maybe a bit awkward, tall and thin with pale skin and a messy mop of dark hair. He didn't fit the usual finance intern image. But it wasn't that which unsettled me. It was the way he behaved around me. At first, it was subtle. He'd pop up at my cubicle, leaning over the divider so his head looked enormous against the low walls, tilting it slightly, grinning with this frozen, unsettling smile. Then he'd speak in this weird, drawn-out voice, almost like he was trying to sound unnervingly eerie. I'd laugh awkwardly, pretending I found it funny, though inside, I felt uneasy. He'd say things like, "Working hard or hardly working, Jamie," in that slow, soft, taunting tone, and hold the grin far too long. The first few times, I chalked it up to him being quirky, trying too hard to stand out. But it didn't stop. Every day, at least once, his head would slowly appear above the cubicle wall. The same stiff smile. The same strange, off-putting voice. He'd talk about nothing, make odd jokes, or just mutter random phrases that made no sense. The other interns noticed too, but they laughed it off, assuming he was just goofing around. I think they also assumed Ryan and I had some kind of secret rapport he didn't share with anyone else. But it didn't feel that way. It felt targeted, like I was his audience for whatever unsettling performance he had planned. Weeks went on, and the visits stretched longer. Sometimes he'd lean over for minutes, staring at me, saying barely anything. I'd fake a laugh, mumble about finishing a report, and hope he'd take the hint. Rarely did he. Then, about 6 weeks into the internship, I was home eating dinner when my phone rang. It was an unknown number. I usually ignored calls I didn't recognize, but I was waiting on a delivery, so I picked up. If you love horror stories, hit subscribe. We post one every day. When I picked up the phone and said hello, there was nothing, just a few long seconds of dead, breathless silence. Then a voice finally came through, and my stomach dropped. I recognized it instantly. It was Ryan's voice, that same fake creepy tone he used at the office, except this time it was louder, almost shouted, like he wanted it to echo in my head. He said, dragging out every word like a riddle, "The tide's coming in. Pull your boat out of the water, Jamie." Then he burst into this wild, manic laughter, so loud and jagged it sounded like it hurt him to produce it. Before I could say anything, the call disconnected. What terrified me wasn't just the call itself. It was that I had never given Ryan my number. Not once. I immediately texted the number, asking if this was him, but it bounced back undelivered. When I looked up the number, it turned out to be a landline. That made my skin crawl. How did he even get it? And why call me like that? I tried to calm myself by thinking maybe he found it on some company contact sheet. But even then, the way he said that strange line, I couldn't stop replaying that laugh. It didn't sound like a joke. It sounded like someone who had crossed a line in his mind, someone who wanted me to feel fear. When Monday came, I forced myself to go in. Ryan's desk was empty. He didn't show up all morning. Finally, I went to our supervisor, his name was Daniel, and asked if interns had access to anyone's phone numbers. He looked confused and said absolutely not. Then he told me something even worse. They'd fired Ryan at the end of the previous week for refusing to do assignments and ignoring warnings. I told him about the call. A few nearby interns overheard, exchanging looks, admitting Ryan had creeped them out, too. I explained the cubicle visits, the voice, everything. Daniel tried to reassure me, said Ryan was gone and wouldn't be coming back. For the next week, nothing happened. No calls, no messages, no unexpected encounters. Office life eased back into something normal. I began to think maybe the situation really was over. Then one Friday morning, around 5. Still dark except for a thin gray glow behind the blinds. I woke up because I thought I heard something, maybe a rustle outside. I wasn't even fully conscious when I walked to my window. I should have stayed in bed. Standing in my backyard, Halfway between the trees and the porch light was a tall, thin figure staring up at my window. Even in the dim light, I knew exactly who it was. The gaunt frame, the messy hair, the stiff posture. It was Ryan. For several seconds, I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. I just stared at him, trying to understand how he was here. Then, in that same slow, theatrical voice he used at work, he called my name. Drew it out like a sing-song. Jamie. My whole body locked up. I grabbed my phone, ready to call 911, when he suddenly threw his head back and started laughing. Loud, hysterical, completely unhinged. The exact same laugh from the phone call, but this time it echoed across my yard. I yelled through the window, shouting that I was calling the police, demanding he get off my property. I even held my phone out the window so he could see it. He lingered for a moment longer, then turned and walked toward the tree line behind my house, still letting out that jagged, unsettling laugh as he vanished into the shadows. I called the police immediately. The dispatcher asked if he was still there, and when I said no, she told me to call back if he returned or tried to break in. After that morning, I never saw him again. Not at the office, not around town, nowhere. The police couldn't do much since he hadn't physically trespassed or made a direct threat. It was one of those situations where all you can do is live with the unease and hope it's over. The rest of the summer passed quietly. I finished the internship, and on the last day, my boss pulled me aside to offer a permanent position after graduation. At the time, I accepted. A small part of me felt uneasy about ever returning to that office, but I never mentioned what had happened that morning. Ryan was gone, and no one knew where he ended up. Over time, I tried to rationalize it. Maybe he was dealing with some mental illness or social disorder that made him act that way. It was the only way to make sense of how he went from awkward, quiet intern to standing outside my backyard at 5 in the morning, laughing like a man unmoored from reality. It's been a few years since then, and I've moved on. I didn't take the job at that company after all, and found a different path after graduation. I don't dwell on it, but every now and then, I still picture him in my backyard. I still wonder how he got my number, how he knew where I lived, and what he intended that morning. With the way personal info is so accessible online these days, it's not hard to imagine. All I know is that for a brief stretch of my life, I worked alongside someone who was more than just odd. Something darker was going on. And no matter how much time passes, I'll never forget the sound of that laugh echoing in the dark, like it was some private joke only he understood. I was 17 when another unsettling experience happened. My first real job, working at a small grocery store in a quiet Vermont town. It was the kind of place where everyone knew each other and nothing extraordinary ever happened. At first, I liked the job. It was simple, and most of my coworkers were friendly. I fell into an easy rhythm with the cashiers and some of the stock staff, especially during the slow hours. When the store was empty, we'd gather near the front, chatting about TV shows, joking about older employees, or grumbling about customers. Those moments made me feel like I wasn't just staring at a register all day. Depending on the shift supervisor, the atmosphere varied. A younger supervisor meant a more relaxed environment. People on their phones, chatting freely. That's when I noticed a coworker I didn't know well at first, a guy named Tyler. He was 24, a little awkward, and had that weird in-between stage of growing his hair out. Longer than usual, but not quite shoulder length. He worked in the dairy section, so our paths rarely crossed. He was polite, mostly quiet, and I honestly didn't think much of him. Most people just nodded when passing by, and he returned the gesture. Eventually, I was added to a group chat for coworkers, and Tyler was in it. I didn't think much of it at first. It was just a group chat for work, shift swaps, silly jokes, nothing serious, and most of the younger employees were in it. But then Mason started messaging me directly. At first, it seemed harmless. He asked about my shifts, whether I could cover certain days, stuff like that. Over the next few weeks, though, it became clear he was trying to get closer. He asked about my personal life, what kind of music I liked, what I did after work, even small stuff like how I spent my weekends. I didn't think much of it at first. People make small talk, right? But the tone felt off. He'd occasionally call me cute in ways that made me uncomfortable, sometimes drop flirty jokes. I tried to ignore it, thinking maybe he didn't know how to talk to someone my age. I was only 17, and he was much older. I don't think anyone else noticed the way he was acting. The persistence started to get under my skin. He'd comment on things I posted online, and messages would come late at night. Not threatening, Not overtly scary, but the constant attention made me uneasy. I didn't know how to tell him to back off without making things awkward at work, so I mostly ignored him. One evening, I was at home, completely absorbed in Stranger Things, binge-watching the latest season in my bedroom. A couple of days later at work, everyone was gathered near the front of the store, talking about TV shows. I was chatting with some of the cashiers about random series when Mason suddenly asked, "You like Stranger Things, right?" I froze. I hadn't told anyone at work about the show. I just nodded and tried to brush it off, but a cold pit formed in my stomach. How did he know? We made eye contact for a moment. He just gave this awkward little smile and walked back to the dairy section as if nothing had happened. But I couldn't shake the feeling he had been watching me more closely than I realized. A few nights later, the fear escalated. I was lying in bed, trying to fall asleep, when I heard a soft scraping at my bedroom window. At first, I thought it was the wind or a branch brushing against the glass. But then it happened again, a distinct, deliberate tap, just light enough to make me nervous. I peeked through the blinds, expecting to see Mason, but there was nothing. My mind kept returning to that question at work about Stranger Things, and it made my skin crawl. A couple of days after that, he texted me again. This time, I didn't ignore it. I told him firmly I wasn't interested. Almost immediately, he replied, "Okay, good luck changing your address." I couldn't believe it. That one message confirmed all my suspicions. I saved the texts, took screenshots, and went straight to my manager, explaining everything. She was shocked and immediately assured me that the situation would be handled. I went with my dad to the local police station to file a report. I showed them the messages and explained the incident with the window, making it clear that I suspected Mason might be stalking me. The next day at work, our manager called him in. He never came back. It turned out he was fired immediately, and the police started processing a restraining order. Even with the restraining order in place, I quickly realized that nothing felt truly over. If Mason was unstable, what was a piece of paper really going to do to stop him from showing up at my house? I became obsessive about checking locks, refused to answer unknown calls or messages, and avoided sharing any routine details with anyone besides my family. The days and nights dragged on like that. I would wake up convinced I heard someone outside. I had to remind myself constantly that the restraining order was legally binding, that he couldn't come near me, but the fear was real. Gradually, over weeks and then months, the paranoia began to fade. There were no new incidents, no messages, no appearances. The restraining order seemed to work, and life slowly returned to something close to normal. I grew comfortable going out alone again, stopped checking my window obsessively before bed, and eventually stopped thinking about Mason altogether. It took a long time, though, to feel fully safe. Even after moving on, the experience left a mark. I became hyper-aware of my surroundings, careful with new people, especially in isolated situations. I learned to trust my instincts and take any uncomfortable behavior seriously, no matter how small it seemed at first. Looking back, what still unnerves me isn't that Mason might have harmed me. It's how quickly someone who seems ordinary, even awkward or harmless, can become a source of real fear. It can start with small, seemingly innocent interactions, questions, or comments, and escalate into something far more serious. Years later, I've moved on. I live in a different town now, work a new job, and have a fresh apartment. I don't keep in touch with anyone from that grocery store. But the memory of those nights lying in bed, convinced someone was outside my window, never fully disappears. It's a reminder of how quickly life can feel unsafe, even in a quiet, small town. Even though Mason never physically harmed me, the psychological impact was enough to make me question my safety. The lesson I learned is simple. If a coworker crosses a line, even subtly, take it seriously. Don't shrug it off as awkwardness or harmless flirting. It may seem overblown at first, but acting early can save months of fear, or worse. Eventually, I did move on. And now, years later, I can look back and know I survived. That's enough. When I was 26, I started working at a small insurance office in a quiet Pennsylvania town. It was tucked behind a strip mall, with one long row of desks, flickering fluorescent lights, and the constant smell of coffee. It wasn't glamorous, but it paid the bills, and most of the people there were nice. The job could get dull, especially on slow days when the phones barely rang, but it was easy money. I usually worked the day shift, But that Friday I was scheduled to help close the office because we were behind on filing a stack of client records. A severe storm warning had been flashing on every local news channel for hours, and when I looked out the window that morning, I could tell it was going to be a dark, rainy day. By around 3 in the afternoon, sheets of rain were hammering the street outside, and the thunder rolled so hard it made the walls shake. Most of the employees left early, but a couple of us volunteered to stay and finish paperwork. The only other person who stayed was a guy named Ethan, who had started a couple of weeks before. He was in his early 30s, tall, quiet, and had an odd, hard-to-place energy. Not outright creepy, but off. He never initiated conversation, yet he was always nearby. If I went to refill the printer paper, he'd appear a few minutes later pretending to do the same. I assumed he was just socially awkward. By 5, the storm was raging. Lightning streaked across the sky every few seconds, followed by thunder that made the floor tremble. The office felt emptier than usual, the usual hum of fluorescent lights replaced by the storm's roar. Ethan was at his desk a few rows down, typing something that looked like gibberish from my angle. Every time I glanced up, I caught him staring in my direction. I tried to focus on my work, but an hour passed, and I realized he hadn't moved once. Around 6:30, the lights started flickering. We both laughed nervously when they dimmed, but he didn't speak. Then the lights went out completely. The office fell silent except for the rain, with only the emergency lights giving everything a faint orange glow. I suggested maybe it was a good time to head out. Ethan didn't respond. I heard keys jingle and the front door click shut. He muttered something about it not being safe to go outside yet. I tried to shrug it off as him being cautious, but the tone of his voice sent chills down my spine. I grabbed my bag and jacket, planning to wait a few minutes before leaving. The outage made the office feel cramped and unfamiliar. Hallways were dimly lit, and the storm outside was deafening. When I came back toward the front, Ethan was standing near the door, staring into the dark, rain-soaked parking lot. I told him I needed to call my boyfriend to let him know I'd be home soon. No response. He just kept watching the storm. I walked to the break room and tried my phone, but there was no signal. Even the landline was dead. When I turned back toward the office, I froze. Ethan was in the doorway, holding a small flashlight under his chin, casting jagged shadows across his face. A half-smile curled on his lips, like he found the whole thing amusing. I forced a nervous laugh and said he'd scared me. Then I asked about unlocking the door again, but he just said it wasn't safe yet, that it was better to wait for the worst of the storm to pass. I said okay, but inside, a cold knot of unease had formed in my stomach. Ethan kept watching me. I moved to my cubicle to pack my things, trying to act calm, planning to wait for a lull in the storm before leaving. A few minutes later, when I glanced up, he was gone. I assumed he might have gone to the restroom. I decided to make a run for the back door instead of the front. It led to a small parking lot behind the building where my car was. When I reached it, the handle wouldn't budge. Someone had looped a chain and padlock around it from the inside. That had never happened before. I ducked into the supply closet next to the break room, quietly closing the door behind me, trying to slow my frantic breathing. I could hear Ethan moving down the hallway, slow and deliberate. Then he called my name in a soothing voice, saying he just wanted to make sure I was safe. I stayed silent, my heart hammering so loud I could swear he might hear it. He passed by the closet, the thin line of flashlight shining briefly under the door before disappearing. A sharp crack of thunder rattled the building, followed by a surge of rain pounding harder than ever. I realized part of the roof above the break room was leaking. I waited, probably 10 minutes, before cautiously cracking the door open. The hall was empty. The flashlight beam was gone. I stepped out carefully and made my way toward the front of the office. Then I froze. The front glass door had been smashed completely. Rain blew across the floor, soaking the carpet. Ethan was nowhere in sight. My mind raced. Had he gone outside? Realizing this was my only chance, I bolted into the storm and sprinted for my car. I didn't care about getting drenched. My hands shook so badly I could barely turn the key in the ignition. I didn't look back as I sped away. At home, I locked every door and sat in the living room trembling, watching rain pour against the windows. Sleep didn't come that night. The next morning, I called the office and told my manager what had happened. At first, he didn't believe me, until he got there and saw the shattered glass. He called the police, who took a statement and said they would investigate. Ethan had disappeared. His car was still in the lot, unlocked, with his keys on the driver's seat and his phone, wallet, and personal items inside. The security cameras had been manually disabled before the power outage, meaning he had planned it in advance. No one ever saw him again. Some coworkers speculated that he'd had a breakdown, but I couldn't stop wondering if he'd intended something far worse. I quit the job a month later. Even though nothing further happened, I couldn't bring myself to work in a small, enclosed office again. The memory of that night made it impossible,